The Majestic Theater's chandelier sparkled under stage lights as Christian Ashford held his final note, the audience erupting in applause that should have filled the emptiness inside him. At 34, he'd conquered Broadway with his technically flawless voice and leading man looks, yet every standing ovation felt like an echo in a vast, hollow space. His girlfriend, Celeste Beaumont, the production's prima donna, blew him a kiss from the wings, her diamond bracelet catching the light like the calculated smile she wore for photographers. 3 blocks away, in a cramped costume shop basement, Nora Sullivan hand-stitched sequins onto a chorus girl's dress, her Juilliard-trained fingers moving with precision that betrayed a past she'd buried along with her mother. The city that never slept hummed with 1,000 dreams. But only one story was about to shatter the comfortable lies 2 people told themselves about who they really were. Christian's penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, a view that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. Yet he stood at the window feeling nothing but the weight of perfection. His shelves held 3 Tony Awards, 2 Drama Desk Awards, and a collection of 5-star reviews that praised his impeccable technique, while never once mentioning his heart. The role of the Phantom should have been his crowning achievement, the part every tenor dreamed of, but his vocal coach's words echoed louder than any applause. You sing every note correctly, Christian, and feel absolutely none of them. He poured himself a scotch he didn't want and checked his phone, seeing Celeste's Instagram post from their curtain call. Her caption read, Broadway's power couple, with a heart emoji that felt as manufactured as everything else in his carefully curated life. In a 5th-floor walk-up in Hell's Kitchen, Nora folded her mother's wedding dress for the last time, placing it in a donation box alongside the sheet music from her West End debut, a performance she'd walked away from when the call came that cancer had returned with a vengeance. Her studio apartment smelled like the lavender sachets her mother used to make, a scent that now brought equal parts comfort and grief as she prepared for another day of measuring inseams and fixing hems for performers who'd never know she once stood where they dreamed of standing. The framed Juilliard diploma sat face down in her closet, along with playbills from the London Palladium, where at 23 she'd been the youngest Christine in the production's history, a meteoric rise she'd abandoned without explanation or regret. Tomorrow she'd start her new position as costume assistant at the Majestic Theater, close enough to the world she'd left to feel its pull, distant enough to keep her secret safe, or so she believed before she met Christian Ashford. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Christian arrived at the Majestic Theater at precisely 9 a.m., his assistant trailing behind with his green smoothie and vocal warm-up schedule, a routine so rigid it had become a prison he didn't recognize. The cast greeted him with the reverent deference his status demanded, but he noticed how their smiles faded when he turned away, how the chorus whispered about his impossible standards and complete lack of humor. His co-star Celeste swept in 20 minutes late, kissing him for the assembled cast before whispering that she'd handled the costume situation. Apparently, the previous assistant had dared suggest her waist measurements were different from what she claimed. Christian barely registered the words. Focus instead on the vocal exercises his coach had prescribed, each scale executed with mechanical precision that would have made a Swiss watchmaker weep with joy. The director, Marcus Webb, a theatrical legend with 30 years of Broadway hits, watched from the orchestra seats with a frown that Christian interpreted as approval. After all, no one had ever complained about perfection. The morning's blocking rehearsal revealed the production's central problem, though only Marcus seemed aware of it. Christian hit every mark, sang every phrase flawlessly, and conveyed absolutely no emotional truth whatsoever. His Phantom was a technical marvel and an emotional void, a beautiful mannequin executing someone else's pain with the authenticity of a shopping mall Christmas display. Celeste, by contrast, oversold every moment with theatrical gestures that belonged in a 1920 silent film, her Christine more concerned with hitting her good angles than conveying innocence or fear. The chorus exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the train wreck they feared opening night would become. But Broadway protocol meant no one would speak such truths to stars of Christian and Celeste's caliber. During the break, Christian reviewed his notes with obsessive detail, marking breath points and vowel modifications while completely missing the fact that his performance felt like a demonstration rather than a revelation. Nora reported to the costume department at 10 a.m., introduced the head costumer Margaret Chin, a 60-year-old veteran who dressed everyone from Patti LuPone to Lin-Manuel Miranda and suffered no fools. The workspace was a controlled chaos of fabric bolts, sewing machines, and garment racks labeled with character names in Margaret's precise handwriting. The organized a sort of a department that kept the show running while remaining invisible to audiences. Celeste's station alone took up a quarter of the room, her custom pieces hanging under protective covers like priceless artifacts in a museum, each fitting adjusted to maintain the fiction of her 24-inch waist. Nora's assignment was clear. Maintain the costumes, handle quick changes, and under no circumstances offer opinions about the actor performances or personal lives. Margaret had been burned before by assistants who forgot discretion was more valuable than talent. The first costume call was at 2 p.m., giving Nora 4 hours to familiarize herself with every piece in production, a task that would have overwhelmed most people, but felt like coming home to someone who'd once lived and breathed this world. Celeste arrived at her fitting 30 minutes late, her phone glued to her ear as she complained about the car service to someone who clearly wasn't listening. She barely acknowledged Nora's greeting, stepping onto the fitting platform while continuing her conversation about some charity gala where she needed to be seen with the right people. Margaret handled the measurements with professional detachment, but Nora noticed immediately that the costumes were constructed to add volume in certain areas while cinching others, clever tailoring that created an illusion Celeste desperately needed maintained. When Celeste finally ended her call, she noticed Nora for the first time and demanded to know if she was the new girl, with a tone that suggested she was evaluating livestock. Nora responded with polite professionalism, but something in her bearing, a quiet confidence that comes from having already conquered the mountain others are still climbing, made Celeste's eyes narrow with instant dislike. The afternoon brought Christian to the costume department for his final Phantom coat fitting, and Nora's first impression was a man who confused precision with passion, technique with truth. He stood perfectly still during measurements, offering technical feedback about sleeve length and cape weight with the emotional investment of someone ordering office supplies from a catalog. Margaret introduced Nora as her new assistant, and Christian gave her the briefest nod, his attention already back on his phone, where he was reviewing vocal recordings from the previous night's performance. Nora adjusted the coat's collar. Her Juilliard-trained eye immediately recognizing the physical tension he carried in his shoulders, the kind that comes from singing with power but without proper breath support or emotional release. She said nothing. It wasn't her place, and she'd learned the hard way that unsolicited wisdom was rarely welcomed in the ego-driven world of Broadway stardom. The moment of collision came after the fitting when Marcus called a full company meeting to discuss emotional authenticity in their performances. Christian stood at the front, arms crossed, as Marcus diplomatically suggested that some cast members might benefit from exploring the inner life of their characters beyond the technical execution. Celeste immediately took offense, launching into a speech about her process and how she'd studied Christine's psychology extensively, her defensiveness revealing exactly how much the criticism had landed. Christian remained silent, his jaw tight with an anger he'd probably label as professional standards rather than wounded pride. When Marcus asked if anyone had questions, Nora found herself speaking before her brain could stop her mouth, suggesting that perhaps the Phantom's rage came from a place of profound loneliness rather than simple villainy, a reinterpretation that would require vulnerability Christian clearly wasn't accessing. The room fell silent, 30 pairs of eyes swiveling between the unknown costume assistant and Broadway's golden boy, the tension so thick you could have spread it on toast. Christian's response was ice-cold precision, asking who exactly Nora thought she was to critique his interpretation when she was hired to stitch sequins, not direct the show. Celeste seized a moment, adding that perhaps costume assistants should stick to their lane and let the real artist handle the actual performance work. Nora felt her face flush, not with embarrassment, but with the familiar anger of being dismissed by people who'd never had to sacrifice anything they loved, who'd never walked away from greatness to hold a dying mother's hand. She apologized quietly, the professional thing to do, but Marcus caught her eye and gave a barely perceptible nod that suggested he'd heard exactly what Christian couldn't admit, that she was completely right. The meeting ended with uncomfortable applause and hurried exits, the cast eager to escape the awkward confrontation. But Christian lingered afterward, his pride wounded in a way his perfectionism couldn't compute. Celeste found Christian in his dressing room an hour later, ready to leverage the incident into her advantage. She curled against him on the vintage leather couch, suggesting that the new costume assistant was clearly trying to make herself important by criticizing stars, and maybe it would be better for company morale if Nora was reassigned to a less prominent production. Christian barely listened, still reviewing his performance footage, but he nodded absently when Celeste asked if he wanted her to handle the situation. By 7 p.m., Nora received a text from Margaret. Celeste had lodged a formal complaint about unprofessional behavior, and the producers had decided to let Nora go effective immediately to avoid conflict with their leading lady. She packed her kit without protest, knowing that in the hierarchy of Broadway politics, costume assistants were infinitely more expendable than divas with box office draw. But as she left the Majestic Theater for what she assumed was the last time, she wondered if Christian Ashford would ever find the courage to feel his own performance before it destroyed him. 2 weeks later, Christian stood in Dr. Rachel Morrison's office at Mount Sinai Medical Center, staring at the laryngoscopy images that showed 2 small but definitive nodules on his vocal cords. The ENT specialist explained in careful medical language that Christian had been singing through inflammation for months, compensating with muscle tension that had finally manifested as physical damage that could end his career if not addressed immediately. His options were stark: complete vocal rest for 6 weeks followed by surgery and a year of recovery, or find a vocal rehabilitation specialist who could teach him to sing differently, less powerfully perhaps, but more sustainably, more honestly, more from a place of emotional truth rather than muscular force. Christian felt the walls closing in as Dr. Morrison added that forcing his current technique would likely rupture the nodules during performance, causing permanent scarring that no surgery could fully repair. He'd built his entire identity on technical perfection, and now that very perfection was killing the instrument he'd spent 20 years honing. The production went into crisis mode, with Marcus calling emergency meetings and the producers calculating insurance claims while trying to keep the media from learning their star was potentially finished. Christian's understudy, a capable but inexperienced tenor named David Chun, was ready for opening night in 12 days, and finding a replacement phantom on short notice was impossible in the current Broadway landscape. Celeste used the crisis to position herself as the show's anchor, giving carefully worded interviews about how she'd carry the production through this difficult time, with martyrdom that barely concealed her glee at being the unquestionable star. Christian retreated to his penthouse, forbidden from speaking above a whisper, his 3 Tony Awards now mocking him from their shelf like monuments to a dead man. His phone buzzed constantly with concerned messages he couldn't answer, sympathy that felt like pity, and one text from his mother in Connecticut asking if he'd finally learned that talent without heart was just noise, a philosophical observation. He deleted without responding. Marcus found himself walking past a small costume shop in the garment district 3 days into the crisis, driven by an instinct he couldn't quite name. He'd been thinking about Nora Sullivan's brief comment during that company meeting, about loneliness being the Phantom's core rather than rage, and wondering why a costume assistant would have such sophisticated insight into character motivation. The shop owner, an elderly woman named Rosa who'd been outfitting Broadway for 40 years, confirmed that yes, Nora worked there now, and yes, she was remarkably talented with both needle and thread, though Rosa suspected there was a larger story. When Marcus asked directly if Nora knew any vocal coaches, claiming he needed recommendations for a friend, Rosa's laugh filled the cramped space like church bells, and she suggested he might want to ask Nora about her time at Juilliard before making assumptions about what she could or couldn't do. Marcus felt puzzle pieces clicking together in his mind, the kind of theatrical instinct that had guided him through 3 decades of shows, and he asked Rosa to give Nora his number along with a message: "I owe you an apology, and Christian Ashford owes you his career." Nora sat in her studio apartment that evening, staring at Marcus's text and the flood of emotions it triggered. She walked away from the stage 2 years ago with no regrets, choosing the last precious months with her mother over the standing ovations and stage doors and all the glittering emptiness that came with being Broadway's next big thing. Her mother had made her promise to return when the time was right, but the grief had calcified into a comfortable numbness, and the costume shop felt safe in a way the spotlight never had. Marcus's message was simple. Christian was facing vocal damage that could end his career. Traditional methods had failed, and would Nora consider teaching him to sing with emotional truth rather than technical force? Not as a vocal coach officially, but as a favor to the show and maybe to a man who desperately needed to learn what Nora already knew about sacrifice and authenticity. She looked at her mother's wedding dress, still sitting in the donation box after 2 weeks because she couldn't quite let go and heard her mother's voice as clearly as if she were in the room. "Baby girl, some people need to fall apart before they can become whole, and sometimes we're meant to catch them." Christian's initial response to Marcus's proposal was predictable outrage, demanding to know why his director thought a fired costume assistant could teach him anything about singing. Marcus didn't argue, simply sent Christian a link to a YouTube video, archived footage from London's West End that someone had posted years ago, and that Christian had never seen, because why would Broadway's golden boy watch random theater videos? The video showed a young woman in a white dress, perhaps 23 years old, standing center stage at the London Palladium and singing "Think of Me" from Phantom of Menopause with such perfect emotional truth that the camera operators had literally stopped moving to watch her. Christian played the video 3 times, his music theory brain analyzing the technique, her breast support, her placement, the way she sang from her entire body rather than just her throat. But it was her face that kept him watching, the way she inhabited Christine's hope and fear and innocence with a vulnerability that made every moment feel like confession. The video description read, "Nora Sullivan, youngest Christine in fandom history, graduated top of Juilliard 2021, disappeared from theater 2023. Marcus arranged a meeting at a rehearsal studio in Midtown, neutral territory where Christian's pride might not feel so threatened and Nora's past could be revealed without the circus of the majestic theater." Christian arrived first, his voice still on strict rest, carrying a notebook where he'd written questions because whispering was forbidden by Dr. Morrison's orders. Nora arrived exactly on time, wearing jeans and a worn Juilliard sweatshirt that had probably been vintage when she bought it, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 25 years. They stared at each other for a long moment, Christian seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a costume assistant who'd overstepped, but as a performer who'd achieved everything he was still chasing and had walked away from it all for reasons he couldn't fathom. Marcus made introductions that weren't necessary, then left them alone with a reminder that opening night was in 8 days and Christian's career depended on learning something he'd never been taught, how to let go of perfection and find truth instead. Nora spoke first, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd already faced her worst fears and survived them. She told Christian she wouldn't teach him technique. His technique was flawless, which was precisely the problem. But rather she'd help him understand why the Phantom sang at all, what emotional truth lived beneath the notes he'd been executing like a particularly talented robot. Christian wrote in his notebook, "Why did you leave?" And Nora answered with honesty that cut through his defenses like a spotlight through darkness. She left because her mother was dying and fame couldn't save her, and she discovered that sing without someone to sing for felt like screaming into the void. She asked Christian who he sang for, really sang for, and watched him struggle to write an answer that didn't involve Tony Awards or critics or his parents' expectations or Celeste's Instagram posts. Struggled and ultimately failed because he'd never once considered the question. They sat in silence for several minutes, the rehearsal studio's mirrors reflecting 2 people at opposite ends of a journey, one climbing desperately upward, one trying to decide if she could bear to climb again. Christian's phone buzzed with a text from Celeste asking where he was and why he wasn't answering her calls. Nora saw him grimace and suggested gently that maybe part of his vocal problems came from swallowing words he needed to say, from performing a version of himself as rigidly controlled as his singing, an observation that landed with the force of a diagnostic truth he'd been avoiding for years. She offered him a deal. They'd work together for the next 7 days, not on technique, but on emotional archaeology, digging through his carefully constructed persona to find the real person underneath. If by opening night he could sing one phrase, just one, with genuine emotional truth, even if it meant his voice cracked or his technique faltered, she'd consider a success. Christian stared at his notebook, at all the questions he'd written about vocal exercises and breath support and things he already knew, then slowly crossed them all out and wrote instead, "When did you last sing?" Nora smiled sadly and answered that she hadn't. Not really, not since her mother's memorial service when she'd sung "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" and broken down halfway through because grief doesn't care about your training or your reputation or your carefully maintained composure. Christian's penthouse became their studio, a decision made partly for privacy and partly because he couldn't risk being seen at rehearsal spaces where gossip traveled faster than lighting cues. Nora arrived each morning at 8 a.m., greeted by Christian's assistant who'd been instructed to let her pass without question, though the young man's curiosity was obvious in his hesitant glances. The apartment was exactly what she'd expected. Minimalist design that prioritized aesthetics over comfort, awards displayed with museum-like precision, walls decorated with professionally framed playbills from Christian shows rather than personal photographs. She noticed immediately what was missing. No baby pictures, no family photos, no evidence of life before Broadway or outside the theater. Just a curated portfolio of a man who'd built himself into a brand and forgotten he was supposed to be human underneath. Christian appeared at 8:15, still honoring vocal rest, except for the specialized exercises Nora had prescribed. Carrying 2 cups of coffee, he'd clearly made himself since his assistant had been dismissed for the morning. The first 3 sessions were brutal. Not physically, but emotionally, as Nora forced Christian to examine why he'd chosen a phantom as his dream role. They didn't sing at all. Instead, they talked, or rather Christian wrote in his notebook, while Nora asked questions that felt more like therapy than vocal coaching. She asked about his childhood in an affluent Connecticut suburb where his parents had enrolled him in voice lessons at age 7, not because he loved singing, but because they needed him to excel at something after his older brother became a Harvard-educated lawyer. She asked about his first Broadway role at 24, the one he'd lied about his training to get, spending months in terror that someone would discover he'd learned everything from YouTube videos and sheer determination rather than formal education. She asked about the moment he'd stopped singing for joy and started singing for applause, for approval, for the validation that someone somewhere thought he was enough, and watched him realize he couldn't remember when that shift had happened because maybe he'd never sung for joy at all. By day 4, Christian's vocal rest period ended and Nora had him sing scales, not technically, but emotionally, assigning each note a feeling rather than a pitch. C major became comfort, C sharp became confusion, D became desire, and so on to the octave, forcing him to connect his voice to something deeper than muscle memory. Christian struggled magnificently, his perfect pitch in years of training actively working against him as he kept defaulting to technical precision instead of emotional truth. Nora stopped him repeatedly, sometimes putting her hand on his sternum and making him breathe through grief or anger or fear before allowing him to produce sound. The exercises felt ridiculous to Christian, childish, beneath someone of his caliber, until Nora sang the same scales, and he heard the difference, felt in his own chest, the way her voice carried not just notes but the weight of real human experience. The breakthrough came on day 5 when Nora asked Christian to tell her about his first heartbreak. Not Celeste, not any of the publicized relationships, but the first time he'd let himself be vulnerable and gotten destroyed for it. Christian wrote in his notebook about a girl in high school, Emily, who'd laughed at his confession of love and told him he was too serious, too intense, too much for anyone to actually want. Words that burrowed into his psyche like shrapnel. Nora asked him to sing Music of the Night, while holding that memory, that rejection, that shame, and Christian's voice cracked on the first phrase, broke completely on the second, and by the third line he was crying while singing, his technically perfect voice finally connecting to the phantom's desperate loneliness. Nora didn't say anything, just let him finish the song, sobbing to the final phrases, his voice raw and imperfect and more beautiful than it had ever been when wrapped in the armor of technical flawlessness. Marcus received his first voice recording from Christian that afternoon, just a rough phone video of Music of the Night, with tear-stained cheeks and a cracking voice, and the director found himself crying in his office at the Majestic Theater. This was it, the emotional truth the show needed, the performance that would make audiences feel the Phantom's pain rather than simply admire his tenor range. He texted Christian immediately. "Whatever she's doing, let her keep doing it. This is a performance of your career." Marcus then made a decision that would change everything. He called the production team and told them they needed to extend Celeste's costume fittings dramatically because he wanted Nora back in the building as consultant for the show, a diplomatic fiction that would get her access without triggering Celeste's territorial instincts. The producers agreed immediately. They'd seen Christian's decline and knew that opening night was now just 3 days away with their star barely capable of speaking, let alone singing 8 shows a week. Christian called Celeste that evening, finally ready for a conversation he'd been avoiding for months, only to discover she wasn't interested in talking about his vocal journey or emotional breakthroughs. She'd heard through her networks that Marcus had brought Nora back in some capacity, and her outrage filled Christian's penthouse like toxic gas. How dare he work with that woman after she'd been fired? How dare he prioritize his artistic process over Celeste's comfort? How dare he risk their relationship and public image for some nobody costume girl? Christian found himself hearing Celeste's voice as if for the first time, noticing the way she made everything about her social standing rather than the actual work, about being seen rather than being truthful. When he tried to explain that Nora had helped him find something essential to his performance, Celeste laughed, that dismissive, cutting laugh he'd always interpreted as sophistication but now recognized as cruelty, and told him he was getting emotional like a child instead of behaving like a professional. He hung up without saying goodbye, his hand shaking, and texted Nora, "Tomorrow, I want to try the full role. All of it, however badly I fail." Day 6 brought Christian and Nora to the empty Majestic Theater at 6 a.m. before the crew arrived and the building filled with the normal chaos of tech rehearsals. Marcus met them at the stage door, having arranged for the lighting board and sound system to be available, creating an unofficial dress rehearsal that wouldn't appear on any schedule. Christian wore his Phantom costume and makeup, the physical transformation complete, but it was the internal transformation that mattered as he took his place in the shadows, and Nora cued the opening notes. For 2 hours, Christian performed the entire role with Nora standing in as Christine, reading off a script for the scene she didn't remember, and it was transcendent in its imperfection. His voice still healing, his technique deliberately loosened, but his emotional truth so raw and honest that Marcus found himself again to take notes because he was simply experiencing the story. Christian's Phantom was no longer a technical showcase, but a wounded man desperate for connection. And when he sang "The Point of No Return," his voice cracked on the final note, not from damage, but from the weight of real feeling, and Nora realized she was crying, her own carefully maintained emotional distance shattered by watching someone else discover the courage she'd lost. Marcus stopped him after the full run-through, his face unreadable, and Christian braced himself for criticism, notes, suggestions for technical improvements. Instead, the legendary director simply said, "That's your opening night performance. Don't change a single thing. Don't perfect it. Don't fix it. Say it exactly like this, broken, honest, and real." Christian felt validation flood through him like warmth, but it was Nora's reaction he needed, and when he looked at her, she was staring at the stage with an expression he couldn't read, grief and longing and something else, something that looked like a door opening after being locked for years. Marcus saw it too and made an executive decision that would either save the show or destroy his career. He asked Nora if she considered performing again as Christine just for opening night while they dealt with Celeste's schedule conflicts. A diplomatic lie they both understood meant replacing her. Nora's first instinct was refusal, a panic response born of 2 years of self-protection. But Christian turned to her with an honesty that cut through every defense. "Please, I can't do this with anyone else. I can't sing this truth to someone faking theirs." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in theatrical chaos management, beginning with Marcus's delicate conversation with the producers about creative differences regarding the Christine role. Celeste had been lip-syncing in the upper register for 3 months. Her vocal coach had finally admitted it after signing an NDA, and several cast members confirmed that her wireless mic was sometimes receiving pre-recorded tracks during technically demanding passages. The producers were horrified but not particularly surprised. They'd seen signs but had chosen to ignore them because Celeste's Instagram following and red carpet presence sold tickets better than any review. Marcus presented the evidence with surgical precision, along with a solution. Bring in Nora Sullivan, an unknown but properly credentialed performer who could actually sing the role and frame it publicly as a triumphant return to Broadway rather than a mid-production replacement. The legal team worked overnight on Celeste's exit, crafting language about scheduling conflicts and mutual decisions, while preparing for the social media firestorm they knew was coming. Christian spent those 2 days in a surreal state of focus, running private rehearsals with Nora, while the rest of the cast wondered why their co-star had been banned from the theater. He learned more about her during costume fittings and blocking adjustments than he had in their week of vocal work. How she'd grown up in Queens, daughter of a single mother who cleaned offices to pay for Juilliard auditions. How she'd been told repeatedly she wasn't pretty enough or tall enough or conventional enough for leading roles until she'd proved them wrong in London. She told him about her mother's final weeks, how she'd sung to her every night until morphine took her too far away to hear. And Christian understood for the first time why Nora sang with such devastating honesty. She'd learned that art without authenticity was just time wasting when mortality was the only guarantee. They blocked All I Ask of You on an empty stage at midnight, their voices blending in a harmony that felt less like performance and more like conversation between two people learning to trust each other with their carefully guarded vulnerabilities. Celeste discovered her replacement during a Page 6 interview, the journalist asking for her response to rumors of a cast change before her own publicist could warn her. Her initial response was to call Christian in front of the reporter, a strategic manipulation she perfected, but Christian didn't answer. He was mid-rehearsal with Nora, his phone silenced in his dressing room. Celeste's second call went to Marcus, who very calmly explained that the production had discovered significant vocal issues that made her continuation in the role impossible, and that her final performance would be tonight with a generous settlement and a mutual non-disparagement clause. The word discovered was tactical, implying they just learned about the lip-syncing rather than admitting they'd known for months. And Celeste's lawyer understood immediately that fighting would mean public exposure fraud that could end her career entirely. She agreed to the terms within an hour. Her fury crystallized into a single goal: destroy Nora Sullivan's reputation before opening night and make sure Broadway remembered who the real star was. The cast meeting where Marcus introduced Nora as the new Christine was either going to be a disaster or a triumph, with no middle ground possible given the theatrical community's love of gossip. Nora stood beside Marcus on the majestic stage, wearing simple jeans and a black t-shirt, her Juilliard credentials printed on a single sheet of paper that Marcus had prepared for skeptics. Before he could start a prepared speech, David Chun, Christian's understudy, gasped audibly and said, "Oh my God, you're the London Christine. I watched your performance like 50 times on YouTube when I was studying at Northwestern." The room erupted in whispers, cast members frantically Googling on their phones, finding the archived videos and reviews that called Nora the most emotionally intelligent Christine in a generation before she'd vanished without explanation. Marcus let the discovery happen organically, watching doubt transform into excitement as the chorus realized they were getting a legitimate performer rather than another Instagram influencer who looked good in costume but couldn't actually sing. Christian watched Nora handle the attention with grace and discomfort in equal measure, answering questions about her London run, without mentioning why she'd left, deflecting personal curiosity toward the work they needed to do in the next 36 hours. He saw the moment she spotted a photo someone had found, Nora at 23 on the London Palladium stage door, her mother beside her looking proud despite the oxygen tubes and wheelchair. The image dated 3 months before she withdrawn from production. The pain that flashed across Nora's face was brief but devastating, and Christian found himself moving to her side instinctively, redirecting questions about her past toward questions about their rehearsal process. It was a gesture of protection that surprised them both. Christian had spent his entire career focused on himself, his performances, his reviews, but standing beside Nora felt more important than any performance ever had. The technical rehearsal that afternoon revealed both the challenges and the magic of what they were attempting, as Nora adjusted to Majestic's staging while maintaining the emotional truth she and Christian had built together. The lighting designer, sound engineers, and costume team worked overtime to accommodate her instead of demanding she accommodate them, a respect Marcus had insisted upon given her credentials. During the point of no return, when Christian and Nora finally performed together with full production values, the entire crew stopped working to watch, and when they finished the song you could hear absolute silence, followed by spontaneous applause from people who'd seen hundreds of Broadway shows and thought they were immune to being moved. Marcus knew in that moment they had something special, the kind of performance that could define careers and sell out shows for years, but only if they could survive the next 24 hours and whatever nuclear revenge Celeste was currently planning. The first strike came via social media at 11 p.m. when Celeste posted a carefully edited video of her and Christian at Charity Gala from 3 months ago, captioning it, "To the man who taught me that talent and loyalty matter more than opportunists trying to steal what they didn't earn. Some people will always be costume girls pretending to be artists. Opening night will reveal the truth. Hashtag Broadway family, hashtag real talent, hashtag Phantom family." The post garnered 50,000 likes in the first hour, her followers flooding Nora's barely used Instagram with comments about being a nobody replacement and a homewrecker. Christian saw the post while doing his vocal warm-ups and felt rage replace the nervous energy he'd been channeling into preparation. Celeste was attacking Nora's reputation based on lies. using her social media army as a weapon and counting on Broadway's sexist tendency to blame the other woman rather than examine the actual facts. He called his publicist at midnight with instructions that would either save Nora's reputation or destroy his relationship with Celeste permanently, though that relationship was already corpse cold and had been for months if he was honest. Christian's response post went live at 7 a.m. on opening day, timed perfectly to hit the morning news cycle before critics and audiences arrived at the theater. It was a video of him speaking directly to camera, his voice still slightly rough but emotionally unguarded in a way his followers had never seen. I want to address last night's post. Nora Sullivan is not a costume girl pretending to be an artist. She's a Juilliard graduate who was the youngest Christine in London's fandom history before she walked away from fame to care for her dying mother. She's been teaching me to sing with truth instead of technique, and she's the reason I still have a career. Opening night will indeed reveal the truth, that talent and character matter more than Instagram followers, and I'm grateful to perform opposite someone who embodies both. He tagged Nora's account, disabled comments on his post to avoid a war, and then turned off his phone completely so he could focus on performance ahead. Opening night at the Majestic Theater carried a different energy than usual, the audience sensing drama beyond the stage as they filed past paparazzi who'd gotten word that something extraordinary was happening. The house was sold out, had been for months, but secondary market tickets had tripled in price after Celeste's post and Christian's response. Everyone wanted to witness either a triumph or a disaster with equal voyeuristic enthusiasm. Backstage was controlled chaos of final adjustments, with Nora in a dressing room that still had Celeste's name on the door, surrounded by flowers from cast members and one massive arrangement from Marcus that simply read, "Break a leg. Your mother will be proud." Christian sent her a text of places. "Whatever happens tonight, thank you for teaching me to feel again." And Nora felt tears threaten before forcing them back, because stage makeup and crying don't mix well. The opening notes of the overture silenced the audience's chatter, and when the Phantom's voice first emerged from the shadows, people leaned forward collectively, sensing something different in Christian's delivery even before seeing his face. Nora's first entrance as Christine came during Think of Me, and the moment she hit the first high note, the audience understood this wasn't a replacement. This was an event, a performer operating at a level that reminded older theatergoers of legends like Patti LuPone and Audra McDonald. Her voice had the technical perfection Juilliard promised, but also the emotional weight that couldn't be taught, only earned through genuine suffering and love. In the orchestra pit, the conductor had to remind himself to keep conducting because he was getting lost in Nora's performance. And up in the lighting booth, the crew was texting each other variations of "holy shit" as they adjusted to the magic unfolding below. Christian's transformation was equally remarkable, but in a different register. His Phantom no longer a technical showcase, but a genuinely wounded man whose rage masked desperate loneliness. When he sang Music of the Night, his voice cracked slightly on "Turn your face away from the garish light of day," that imperfection Nora had taught him to embrace rather than fix, and the emotional honesty of the moment made several critics in the audience literally gasp. This wasn't the polished, perfect performance they'd expected from Christian Ashford. This was raw, vulnerable, almost painful in its truth. The New York Times critic, seated front row center, abandoned her prepared review framework and started writing completely new notes about a performance that prioritizes feeling over flawlessness and achieves something Broadway desperately needs: genuine emotional risk. The chemistry between Christian and Nora elevated every scene beyond what the script technically demanded, their voices blending in harmonies that felt less like theatrical convention and more like intimate conversation. During All I Ask of You, when Nora sang directly at Christian's eyes rather than to the balcony, he responded with such tender vulnerability that you could feel the entire theater holding its breath. 2,000 people collectively transported by the radical act of two performers being completely honest with each other. Marcus watched from the wings, tears streaming down his face, knowing he was witnessing the kind of theatrical lightning that couldn't be manufactured or repeated, just experienced in the moment and treasured forever. The stage manager whispered that front of house was reporting audience members crying during scenes that weren't traditionally emotional, responding to the subtext and emotional truth Christian and Nora had built into every interaction. Intermission brought a frenzy of social media activity, audience members posting videos of curtain call clips and exclamations about the performance they were witnessing. Christian's Instagram post from that morning was being shared by major entertainment outlets. The story of Nora's London past and caregiving sacrifice spreading across Twitter faster than the show's marketing team could track. Several celebrities in attendance. Theater people who'd come to support Celeste and found themselves witnessing something entirely different posted their reactions in real time, with Audra McDonald herself tweeting, "Whatever you think you know about the Phantom of the Opera, go see this production. Nora Sullivan is the real deal, and Christian Ashford just proved growth is more important than perfection." The producer stood in the lobby monitoring secondary market ticket prices, which had jumped another 50% during intermission, as word spread that this wasn't just a good show, it was a historic performance. Act 2 built toward the point of no return, the show's emotional and sexual climax, where the Phantom and Christine finally confront their impossible attraction. Christian and Nora had rehearsed this scene dozens of times, but performing it with 2,000 witnesses added a dimension of vulnerability neither had anticipated. They weren't just performing the character's risk, they were taking their own risk in real time. When Christian sang, "Past the point of no return, the final threshold," his voice carried the weight of someone genuinely stepping into unknown territory, and Nora responded with Christine, who was awakening to her own power and desire rather than simply being a passive damsel. Their voices intertwined in the song's final moments, the orchestra swelling beneath them, and several audience members later reported the hair on their arms standing up, a physical response to emotional authenticity that transcends normal theatrical experience. The show's conclusion brought Christian's Phantom to his moment of redemption, releasing Christine not from duty, but from genuine love, an interpretation that only worked because Christian had learned to sing from his heart rather than his ego. His final, "Go now and leave me," carried such devastating loneliness that several cast members in the wings were openly crying, and when he sang the show's last note, the audience remained silent for 3 full seconds before erupting in applause that shook the Majestic Theater's historic walls. Standing ovations are common on Broadway, but this was different. People on their feet instantly, screaming and crying, critics abandoning professional detachment to cheer like teenagers at a concert. Christian and Nora took their curtain call holding hands, both stunned by the response, and when Marcus joined them on stage, the production team bow, he whispered to them, "That's the performance I've been waiting my entire career to direct." The stage door scene after the show looked like a movie premiere, with hundreds of people waiting for autographs and photos despite the February cold. Nora emerged first, overwhelmed by the attention and the realization that she'd just stepped back into a world she thought she'd left forever. A woman in her 60s pushed through the crowd and introduced herself as a vocal coach from Juilliard who taught Nora's mother years ago, telling Nora that she'd seen the performance and knew her mother would be dancing in heaven at her daughter's courage. Christian appeared moments later, and the crowd erupted again, but he moved directly to Nora's side, a gesture that was photographed by dozens of phones and would appear in every entertainment outlet by morning. They signed programs and posed for pictures for over an hour, their exhaustion overridden by adrenaline and the profound satisfaction of knowing they created something true. The official after-party at Sardi's was packed with Broadway elite, all eager to congratulate the new stars and speculate about what this meant for production's future. Christian and Nora held court at a corner booth, fielding questions from journalists and receiving toasts from legends like Christine Baranski and Nathan Lane. But the moment that mattered most came when David Chun, the understudy who'd first recognized Nora, approached them nervously. He thanked Christian for demonstrating that vulnerability was strength, not weakness, and asked Nora if she considered coaching him on emotional technique, because he wanted to bring that same truth to his own performances. Nora agreed immediately, seeing in David's earnest face the same hunger for authenticity she'd once felt. And Christian realized he was watching Nora transform from performer who'd retreated from the spotlight into a mentor who could change the entire industry's approach to technical versus emotional training. The New York Times Review posted at 2 a.m., earlier than usual because the critic couldn't wait to publish what she'd witnessed. The headline read, "Christian Ashford and Nora Sullivan redefined the Phantom with raw emotional truth," and the review was a love letter to their performance, calling Christian's transformation the most courageous artistic growth I've seen in 20 years of covering Broadway, and describing Nora as a generational talent who reminds us that technique without feeling is just elaborate karaoke. By morning, every major publication had similar reviews, with Variety specifically noting the visceral chemistry between the leads and predicting Tony nominations for both. The producers were ecstatic. Advance ticket sales jumped 300% overnight, and scalpers were getting $5,000 for orchestra seats as the show transformed from a standard fandom revival into a must-see cultural event. Christian woke at noon in his penthouse, his body still humming with performance adrenaline, and found 700 text messages waiting on his phone. Most were congratulations, but there were also messages from his estranged father in Connecticut, his former vocal coach, and 3 Broadway producers asking about his availability for future projects. One message stood out, a voicemail from his mother, who'd flown in from Connecticut for opening night without telling him, saying simply that she'd seen him actually feel something for the first time in his life, and she was proud of the man he was becoming rather than the performer he'd been. Christian listened to it 3 times, crying during the 3rd playthrough, then texted Nora asking if she wanted to get breakfast or technically late lunch, because he needed to talk to someone who'd understand what he was feeling without trying to manage or monetize it. They met at a diner in Hell's Kitchen, far from the theater district's expensive restaurants where they'd be recognized, seeking normalcy after the previous night's chaos. Nora arrived wearing her Juilliard sweatshirt and no makeup, looking exhausted and beautiful, and slightly overwhelmed by the dozens of Instagram notifications asking for interviews, podcast appearances, and masterclass opportunities. Christian looked similarly rattled, admitting over coffee that he'd spent years chasing success without understanding what he'd do once he caught it, and last night's performance had felt more like an ending than a beginning, the completion of one journey and the terrifying start of another. They talked for 3 hours, their conversation ranging from technique to mortality to the fundamental question of why anyone chooses to perform at all, and by the time they left the diner, they both understood that something had shifted between them beyond professional collaboration, though neither was quite ready to name it yet. Celeste's counterattack launched that afternoon via her Instagram story and a coordinated interview with Entertainment Weekly that she'd clearly been planning since her replacement. She claimed Christian had been having an affair with Nora for months, that the vocal rehabilitation story was fabricated to justify replacing Celeste with his mistress, and that Nora had deliberately sabotaged Celeste's costumes back when she was working as just an assistant to create opportunities for herself. The allegations were specific enough to sound credible, accompanied by carefully edited photos of Christian and Nora leaving rehearsal studios together over the past week. Her loyal followers, already primed by her previous posts, immediately flooded social media with #JusticeForCeleste hashtags, and several entertainment blogs ran with headlines like Broadway's New Love Triangle. Fact or PR fiction? The narrative was pure fiction, but as Christian's publicist warned him, fiction doesn't matter if it's repeated loud enough by enough people. Perception becomes reality in the attention economy. Christian's first instinct was to issue a statement denying everything, but his publicist had a better idea. Release the security footage from his building showing Nora arriving each morning at 8 a.m. and leaving by 5 p.m. with professional distance and zero intimate behavior. They'd spent a week working together in his apartment, but the footage clearly showed a student-teacher dynamic rather than an affair, though Christian realized with uncomfortable clarity that his feelings had shifted from respect to something deeper during their time together. The publicist also contacted the costume shop where Nora had been working, securing testimony from owner Rosa about Nora's professionalism and the timeline of Celeste's costume issues, which predated Nora's hire by several months. Marcus added fuel to their defense by releasing emails showing Celeste's lip-syncing had been documented and addressed multiple times before Nora ever appeared at the theater. The evidence was overwhelming, but Celeste's followers didn't care about facts. They cared about their parasocial relationship with her and needed someone to blame for her downfall. The situation escalated when James Sullivan, Celeste's business manager and romantic partner, a detail she kept hidden to maintain her eligible single woman image, decided to join the attack. He contacted several blogs with financial documents claiming Nora had been paid exorbitant consulting fees, implying corruption and favoritism from production team. The documents were sophisticated forgeries, good enough that several outlets ran with the story before legal teams could verify their authenticity. Nora called Christian in tears, watching her reputation being destroyed in real time by people who'd never met her, the joy of opening night curdling into a nightmare of speculation and judgment. Christian found himself at her apartment without planning the trip, holding her while she cried and promising they'd fight back, though privately he wondered if his career was worth the collateral damage to someone who'd already sacrificed too much. Marcus called an emergency meeting with Christian, Nora, and the legal team at the production office, where they laid out their options with brutal honesty. They could fight in court, pursuing defamation charges against Celeste and James that would take years and massive legal fees to resolve. They could go nuclear on social media, releasing every damaging detail about Celeste's fraud and James's shady business practices. Or they could do something more strategic. Let the performance speak for itself and trust that audiences would choose truth over tabloid drama. Marcus advocated for the third option, arguing that their opening night had been so transcendent that reviews and word of mouth would overwhelm Celeste's narrative, but it required patience and faith. Qualities difficult to summon when watching your reputation burn in real time. Nora surprised everyone by agreeing with Marcus, saying she'd spent 2 years learning that you can't control what people think, only what you know to be true about yourself. Christian made a different decision, one that would either solve everything or destroy what remained of his public image. He called a press conference for the next morning at the Majestic Theater, telling his publicist and Marcus only minutes before it happened, so they couldn't talk him out of it. Standing on the Phantom's iconic stage with 24 journalists and cameras broadcasting live, Christian told the complete truth. He'd been dating Celeste out of convenience rather than love. She'd been lip-syncing for months while he'd focused on technical perfection instead of honest performance. Nora had saved his career and possibly his life by teaching him to feel instead of perform. He admitted he'd been arrogant and hollow, that he'd fired Nora unjustly, and that her return had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with Marcus's wisdom and his own desperate need for redemption. The room was silent until Christian finished, then erupted in questions, but he simply walked off stage without answering any of them. He'd said what needed saying, and the rest was just noise. The press conference video went viral within hours, Christian's vulnerability and honesty cutting through the cynicism that usually defines celebrity culture. Entertainment outlets that had been skeptical now ran sympathetic pieces about Broadway's bad boy finds his soul, and public opinion shifted dramatically as people watched a successful man admit he'd been wrong, had grown, and was grateful to the woman who'd helped him. Celeste's narrative collapsed under the weight of Christian's truth-telling, her followers splintering as some questioned her version of events, while others doubled down on defending her regardless of evidence. James made the fatal mistake of threatening legal action against Christian for defamation, triggering the production's lawyers to release documentation of his forged financial documents and fraud attempts, a counterpunch that resulted in James himself facing potential criminal charges. By evening, Celeste and James had both deleted their social media accounts and hired crisis management teams. The tables completely turned in less than 24 hours. The second performance of Phantom happened just 36 hours after opening night, with the theater sold out and extra security hired to manage the media circus and social media speculation. The audience was different from opening night. Less industry insiders, more genuine theater fans who'd seen the reviews and wanted to witness a performance everyone was discussing. Christian and Nora gathered the cast backstage before curtain, addressing the elephant in the room. The tabloid drama wasn't the story. The performance was, and they owed it to themselves and the audience to deliver the same emotional truth regardless of who was writing what headlines. The cast responded with a round of supportive applause, the company coalescing around their leads rather than fragmenting into gossip factions. And when places were called, everyone moved to their positions with professional focus despite the chaos swirling outside the theater walls. If anything, the second performance was stronger than opening night. Christian and Nora channeled the week's emotional turbulence into their characters' journeys with devastating effect. During Past the Point of No Return, Christian added a moment of hesitation before touching Nora's face, a tiny adjustment that made the Phantom's longing more painful and Christine's response more courageous. Nora responded by singing the final chorus with her eyes closed, letting herself feel the full weight of impossible love, and the audience's collective gasp was audible even over the orchestra. In the wings, Marcus watched with satisfaction, knowing that controversy couldn't touch performance as genuine. You either felt it or you didn't, and everyone in that theater felt it. The viral moment came during curtain call when an audience member in the mezzanine shouted, "Tell the truth, Nora," during the applause, a reference to Celeste's accusations, and Nora responded by simply taking Christian's hand and bowing together, letting their partnership speak for itself. The moment was captured on dozens of phones and spread across Twitter faster than the cast could change out of their costumes. Within hours, Tell the Truth had become a rallying cry for Nora supporters, with fans posting videos of her performances alongside the hashtag and entertainment journalists writing think pieces about how social media outrage culture needed to be countered with actual excellence. Celeste's remaining defenders found themselves increasingly isolated as the overwhelming consensus became clear. Nora Sullivan was a real deal, and no amount of manufactured drama could diminish her talent. The New York Post ran a front-page story 3 days later that changed everything. Investigative journalists had uncovered that James Sullivan, Celeste's business manager and partner, had a history of exactly this kind of manipulation. He'd worked with 3 previous actresses, each time positioning himself as their manager while also being romantically involved, and each time orchestrating social media attacks against anyone who threatened his client's positions. 2 of the previous actresses had filed restraining orders against him after their relationships ended, citing emotional abuse and financial fraud. One had testimony that James had forged documents to make a rival performer look corrupt, the same playbook he'd attempted with Nora. The article included interviews with voice coaches who confirmed Celeste had been using pre-recorded tracks for at least 2 years across multiple productions, and email evidence suggesting James had been blackmailing theater companies to keep the secret. Marcus received a call from Celeste's lawyer that afternoon, requesting a private meeting to resolve matters amicably now that James's criminal behavior had been exposed. The lawyer admitted off the record that Celeste had been manipulated by James, but had also been complicit in the fraud, knowing about the lip-syncing and the attacks on Nora, but choosing to benefit from them rather than stop them. Marcus's response was ice cold. The production would not pursue legal action against Celeste personally if she issued a public apology to Nora and Christian, admitted to the vocal fraud, and accepted full responsibility for her participation in the smear campaign. The alternative was that the production would release every bit of documentation they had, including audio recordings of Celeste's producers discussing how to hide her lip-syncing, which would end her career permanently rather than leaving room for eventual redemption. Celeste agreed within an hour, her lawyer noting that James was already being investigated by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for wire fraud and extortion. Celeste's public statement appeared on her Instagram at 8 p.m., written clearly by her lawyers, but carrying enough personal detail to seem genuine. She admitted she'd been lip-syncing, acknowledged that Nora was a legitimate performer who had earned a position through talent rather than manipulation, and apologized specifically to both Nora and Christian for allowing her professional disappointment to turn into personal attacks. The statement stopped short of admitting James's criminal behavior. That would come later through legal proceedings, but it was enough to shift public perception from viewing her as victim to recognizing her as someone who'd made serious ethical mistakes. Her followers' responses were mixed, some offering forgiveness while others felt betrayed. But the immediate effect was that Nora's reputation was cleared and the story could finally move forward from tabloid drama to celebrating the actual performance. Christian and Nora avoided most of the media coverage, focusing instead on maintaining their performance schedule and developing the deeper connection that had been building between them since their first rehearsal. They'd been having dinner together after most performances, initially to debrief about the show, but increasingly just to talk about everything else, their childhoods, their fears, their dreams beyond Broadway. Christian admitted he'd never actually wanted fame. He wanted his parents' approval, which he confused with public validation until Nora taught him the difference. Nora confessed that she'd been hiding from grief by hiding from the stage, thinking that avoiding the spotlight meant avoiding the pain. But performing again had shown her that art was how she honored her mother's memory rather than escaped it. One night after the show, walking through Times Square's neon chaos, Christian stopped and asked Nora if she thought 2 people could build something real while living in the public eye, and her answer, only they remembered that the performance ended curtain call, made him kiss her right there under Broadway lights while tourists took photos they never realized the significance of. The relationship shift happened gradually enough that they couldn't identify a specific moment when professional partnership became something more, but the cast noticed immediately and with universal approval. David Chun joked that their chemistry on stage had become almost illegally hot, and the stage manager started timing their curtain calls because audiences wouldn't stop applauding when Christian and Nora took their bows together. Marcus pretended not to notice, but privately he was delighted, not because romance sold tickets, though it certainly didn't hurt, but because he was watching two damaged people help each other become whole through the vulnerability art demands. His only concern was the same concern every director has when leads start dating. What happens to show if the relationship falls apart? Though watching Christian and Nora together suggested they'd figure out something most theater couples never learn: how to separate the performance from the person without diminishing either. The final validation came from an unexpected source. The Theater Development Fund announced that based on advanced ticket sales and critical response, Phantom of the Opera will be extending its limited run indefinitely, and they were commissioning Nora to develop a masterclass series on emotional truth in musical theater performance. The organization specifically noted that her approach, prioritizing feeling over technical perfection, represented a paradigm shift the industry needed, especially given the rise of vocal processing and auto-tune that allowed performers to sound perfect while feeling nothing. Nora was overwhelmed by the recognition, but Christian reminded her that she'd already been teaching this approach for years through her work with him, and now she just had a platform to reach more people. They celebrated at the same Hell's Kitchen diner where they'd had breakfast after opening night, and Christian proposed a toast to uncomfortable growth, embarrassing vulnerability, and the courage to feel everything even when it hurts. Words that made Nora cry into her coffee, while agreeing that yes, exactly that, always that. 6 months after opening night, the Majestic Theater had become Broadway's most sought-after ticket, with Christian and Nora's Phantom selling out every performance and generating waiting lists that extended into the following year. The production had won 5 Tony Awards, including Best Revival, Best Actor for Christian, his first one that felt earned rather than given, and Best Actress for Nora's Broadway debut, a Cinderella story that entertainment outlets covered as proof that talent still mattered in an industry increasingly driven by social media metrics. Christian's acceptance speech had been characteristically vulnerable, thanking Nora for teaching me that breaking is how light gets in, a reference that sent half the theater into tears and launched 1,000 think pieces about masculinity and emotional courage. Nora's speech had been simpler. This is from my mom, who told me that art without honesty is just time wasting. I wasted enough time. No more. The real transformation happened offstage, where Christian and Nora had navigated their relationship with the same careful honesty they brought to their performances. They'd moved slowly despite tabloid pressure for engagement announcements, choosing instead to build a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that could support the weight of 2 careers lived in public. Christian had started therapy to address the emptiness that had driven his perfectionism, discovering that his need for applause stemmed from childhood emotional neglect he'd been medicating with achievement rather than addressing directly. Nora had begun writing about her caregiving experience, turning her grief into a memoir that her agent predicted would resonate with anyone who'd sacrificed dreams for love. The book's working title was A Space Between Spotlights, exploring what happens when we step away from performance to tend to what actually matters. Christian proposed on the Majestic Theater stage during their 1-year anniversary performance, breaking character after the final curtain call to kneel in his Phantom costume and ask Nora if she'd marry him in front of 2,000 witnesses and millions more watching via social media live streams. Nora's response: "I thought you'd never ask, but also, you're ruining my makeup, you ridiculous man," was perfect in its honest imperfection, and the audience's reaction was so loud that the stage manager had to ask everyone to exit the building so the cast could finally leave for the night. The engagement became Broadway legend, covered by every entertainment outlet, and celebrated by a theater community that recognized Christian and Nora represented something rare. 2 people who'd found success without losing themselves, who'd survived fame without sacrificing honesty, who'd built love on foundation of mutual respect rather than manufactured romance. The wedding happened 9 months later at the Majestic Theater during their day off, a small ceremony for close friends and family that somehow felt more significant than any performance they'd given on that same stage. Nora wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, but preserving the lace her mother had hand-sewn 40 years earlier, a connection across generations that left few dry eyes in the assembled company. Christian's vows were simple. I promise to feel everything, to never hide behind perfection, and to love you as honestly as you taught me to sing. Nora's vows were equally direct. I promise to keep singing, keep risking, and keep reminding you that the performance ends at curtain call, but we get to be real people forever. Marcus officiated. using his theatrical authority to make them officially husband and wife, and the reception that followed in Sardis felt less like a celebrity event and more like a family celebration, which is exactly what their theater company had become over the past year. The announcement came 2 months after the wedding. Nora was pregnant, a revelation she shared with Christian before telling anyone else during a quiet moment in their shared dressing room. Christian's response was to hold her and cry, not from fear or pressure, but from overwhelming gratitude that his life had somehow transformed from empty success to genuine fulfillment in less than 2 years. They agreed to keep performing through Nora's second trimester, after which she'd take maternity leave while Christian mentored David Chun as his replacement Phantom, a passing of the torch that felt appropriate given how much David had grown under their influence. The production announced a limited engagement for the Ashford Sullivan Phantom, with tickets selling out within minutes. Everyone wanted to see the final performances of the couple who'd changed Broadway's understanding of what vulnerability and truth could achieve on stage. The press coverage of their pregnancy focused predictably on fairy tale narratives, from costume girl to Broadway queen, but the real story was more nuanced and more beautiful. Nora had taught Christian that success without authenticity was just another performance, while Christian had shown Nora that hiding from the spotlight meant hiding from herself. Together they demonstrated that talent matters, that growth is possible, that vulnerability is strength, and that the American dream looks different than the glossy Instagram version, but feels infinitely more real. Their final performance together was simulcast in movie theaters worldwide, with proceeds going to the foundation they'd established to provide musical theater training for students who couldn't afford traditional programs, a legacy that would outlast any performance or review. The Tony Award ceremony 9 months after their wedding brought the story full circle as Christian and Nora returned to accept the special Tony Award for transformative impact on American musical theater. They walked the red carpet, Nora visibly pregnant and radiating joy, Christian holding her hand with the protective tenderness that had made him a better actor and a better man. Their acceptance speech, delivered jointly, summarized what they'd learned. Art demands we feel everything. The pain, the joy, the fear, the love. Perfection is safe but dishonest. Vulnerability is terrifying but true. We started this journey as two people afraid to be fully human, and we're ending it as partners committed to feeling everything, loving openly, and teaching others that the only performance that matters is the one where you risk your actual heart. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, but the impact of their words would resonate much longer. 6 weeks later, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, after Nora's mother and after the concept that had saved them both. Christian was present for the delivery, coaching Nora through contractions with the same patience she'd shown teaching to breathe through emotional phrases, their partnership complete in every dimension. The first photo they posted showed Grace sleeping on Nora's chest, captioned simply, "Our greatest performance yet, and this one gets to live outside the spotlight." Christian's parents visited from Connecticut, his father apologizing for pressuring Christian toward achievement rather than happiness. A reconciliation that completed Christian's journey from performing for approval to living for joy. Nora's father, who'd been largely absent during her childhood, sent flowers with a note acknowledging he'd missed most of her life, but hoped to be present for Grace's. A tentative peace offering they both knew would take time to develop into actual relationship. The production company Christian and Nora founded, named Grace Notes after their daughter and their artistic philosophy, began operations with a mission statement that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier: to develop musicals that prioritize emotional truth over commercial formulas, that cast for talent rather than social media following, and that paid living wages to all company members, including chorus and crew. Their first production was a musical adaptation of Nora's memoir about caregiving and grief, with music by an unknown composer from Queens and a cast that mixed Broadway veterans with fresh Juilliard graduates. Marcus directed, bringing his legendary instincts to material that was risky, intimate, and commercially uncertain, exactly the kind of project Broadway needed but rarely supported. The development process took 2 years, but when the space between spotlights finally opened off Broadway, critics called it the most emotionally honest musical in a generation, and advanced ticket sales suggested audiences were hungry for authenticity in an era of manufactured entertainment. Christian's career evolved beyond performing as he developed a reputation as the industry's most impassionate vocal coach. working primarily with singers who'd been told they were technical failures, but who actually just needed permission to feel instead of perfect. He taught from the same penthouse apartment where Nora had once coached him. The space transformed from sterile perfection into comfortable chaos, with Grace's toys scattered among the Tony Awards and gold records. His client list included everyone from Broadway newcomers to Grammy winners who'd secretly been struggling with the same emptiness Christian had conquered, and his teaching philosophy was simple. Sing with your whole body, your actual heart, and your authentic story. Everything else is just karaoke with better lighting. He never charged struggling performers. Money was no longer the point, and his waiting list extended 2 years despite, or perhaps because of his insistence on emotional honesty over commercial viability. Nora returned to performing 16 months after Grace's birth, starring in the Broadway transfer of The Space Between Spotlights, opposite a rising young actor who reminded her of Christian before vulnerability had cracked his armor. The show ran for 3 years, winning the Tony for Best New Musical and establishing Grace Notes Productions as Broadway's most innovative company. Nora's performance earned her a second Tony, but more importantly, it sparked a cultural conversation about caregiving, grief, and the impossible choices women face between ambition and family. Conversations that led to policy changes in actors' equity regarding parental leave and child care support. She used her platform not just to perform, but to advocate for structural changes that would allow future performers to have both careers and families without sacrificing one for the other. The final scene of this unlikely love story takes place 5 years after that first opening night, at the Majestic Theater where Christian and Nora had transformed themselves and each other. They returned for a special anniversary performance of Phantom, a one-night-only benefit for their foundation, with Grace watching from the wings alongside Marcus and the original cast. Christian's voice carries the same emotional honesty Nora taught him, though now it's textured by experience and fatherhood and 5 years of living authentically. Nora's Christine is deeper too, less about technical perfection, and more about a woman who's learned that love means showing up fully present even when it's terrifying. During curtain call, they hold hands and bow together as they have hundreds of times, but this time they're flanked by Grace, who insists on joining them despite the bright lights and huge crowd, their daughter already learning that vulnerability is a gift rather than a risk. Standing in the wings after the performance, watching his family laugh together while signing programs for fans who've waited in the cold, Christian thinks about the man he was before Nora taught him to feel. That man wouldn't recognize this life. Messy, unpredictable, filled with actual emotions rather than performed ones, and wouldn't believe it's infinitely preferable to the sterile perfection he'd once thought was success. Nora catches his eye and smiles a smile that made him fall in love with her truth, and Grace tugs his hand asking if they can get hot chocolate before going home, and Christian realizes this is what the American dream actually looks like, not fame or fortune, though they are both, but the courage to be fully human with people who love you for exactly that. The performance ends at curtain call, but the real show, the one that matters, is a life they're building together one honest moment at a time, and that's the story he'll spend the rest of his life grateful to tell.